Good afternoon, Kansas City. Thank you for tuning in to another installment of our Restore KC virtual public programs. My name is Paul Gutierrez, Director of Programs and Events for the Kansas City Museum. A quick update on the museum. Our staff and leadership are working really hard to reopen this museum this fall as a new museum of Kansas City history and culture. In the meantime, we'll continue with these virtual public programs. In addition, this summer, we will activate the lawn with outdoor safe distance concerts, pop-up yoga, and hopefully a movie night here or there. As always, thank you for tuning in. Today, we're going to welcome back Dr. Sean Rosst, who last time talked about the Missouri Bicentennial. This afternoon, he will talk about sports and that pandemic. Hey, Sean.
Hi, Paul. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
For people who might not know you, can you just do another brief introduction of who you are before you begin your presentation?
Certainly. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Sean Rosst. I am the oral historian for the State Historical Society of Missouri, as well as the Missouri Humanities Council. And I've also taught Missouri history in a number of general survey United States history classes for different colleges throughout Missouri.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'll let people know if you have any questions or comments, just drop them in the comment box below. At the end, we'll have Q&A for individuals. And also thanks to One Kansas City Radio, this will also be available on a podcast for later use. So take it away.
Thank you, Paul. And good afternoon, everyone. I think there have been a lot of questions over time in thinking about the current COVID-19 crisis, and questions about, not only what it means for the present and for the future, but also looking back to the past and understanding what the situation was in the last significant pandemic in United States history, which was the 1918 influenza pandemic. And in looking over that, I've seen a number of different perspectives on it, looking at it from political to social to even health studies. And I wondered how society grappled with that. And one of the first things I thought about in my own life in encountering COVID-19 was simply the first moment of it, realizing just how significant of a pandemic it was. And that was really the day that sports in some ways stopped, as there was kind of national shutdowns of different elements of it. It was a striking moment in some ways. So I wanted to kind of look back and see, how did people respond to the 1918 influenza pandemic, especially when it came to recreation, sports, things like that. And how did sports offer them in some ways an avenue to what they saw, and to take a term from Warren Harding, who was a Republican presidential candidate and later president, in 1920, a return to normalcy, as they called it. So today we're going to look a little bit at that subject matter, this kind of attempt to return to normalcy in the midst of a pandemic, and also looking at how athletics and sports played a role in that. And the quote here, "Surely the Missouri spirit is not dying out," will come out later on, and we'll kind of highlight some of that. Now, to begin with, we need to understand what is going on at the time. And for most people, we often think about 1917, 1918 being World War I. And of course, that was a major global crisis in many ways. It begins in 1914 with the beginning of the war over in Europe. Eventually, the United States becomes involved in 1917, and the war lasts until November of 1918. Now, as people are called up and being shipped overseas, there are also a number of significant training facilities across the country that are preparing individuals for war, both on the home front, but also overseas, of course. And one of the major ones is Camp Funston, which is located in Fort Riley, in kind of central eastern Kansas there, what would today be along Interstate 70, as you're kind of leaving away from Topeka and, just a little bit south of Manhattan, Kansas. Now, Camp Funston becomes important because it's one of the central locations for people living in Missouri, Kansas, and much of the Midwest for their location for training service. There are many Missourians and Kansans who, when they are called up for war, will be training at Camp Funston. Some of them will also go to Great Lakes over in Illinois. And it is at Camp Funston that the second major crisis of this era begins in many ways, and that is the influenza outbreak. It has often been called the Spanish flu, and much of that has been attested to the openness by the Spanish media at that time to report on the influenza outbreak at a time when it wasn't really being reported on in the United States. Thus, the awareness of the Spanish press discussing it led people to assume it is of Spanish origin and call it the Spanish flu. From Camp Funston, it really develops from kind of the local agricultural system. And as soldiers are shipped not only across the world in preparation for their involvement in World War I, but even across the country to other bases, the flu then spreads in a similar manner. It is largely overlooked in some ways in the spring and in the summer of 1918. It is moving into different cities, it is moving into different locations, but it is really not until we get to the fall of 1918 that you have the first major awareness that there is an epidemic, a pandemic going on nationwide. And in Missouri, that date really falls, and in Kansas as well, into mid-October. And it's surprising to think that when you look at newspapers from the day, October 10th is a common day in which all of a sudden it's all over the newspapers and it doesn't stop for at least 2 months. Now, we begin to see it really in a lot of the newspapers in and around Kansas City around this time as well, October 12th into October 15th and later on in the month. And I selected here three newspaper clippings to kind of give you an idea of different suggestions and approaches about it. The first one we have from the Post-Dispatch in St. Louis, which is actually covering Kansas City and discussing how influenza is spreading around Missouri, as well as noting locations in Kansas as well as Oklahoma. The second one comes from the Kansas City Sun, which was a notable Kansas City African-American newspaper that predated the later very well-known Kansas City Call, which discusses how African-American residents of the city should try to help the health department in eradicating influenza. And finally, from El Cosmopolitan, we have a Spanish language newspaper talking about the effects of Kansas City. And this one comes out a little bit later on. This is in November of 1918. And it's basically saying that influenza has come back and it is threatening Kansas City once more. And this is a stark reminder here as we get into later conversations about athletics and sports, is that there was a first general major wave in October. It subsides. People assume it's okay to go back out. It's okay to return to daily life. And there is another wave that hits towards the end of November and into December that rolls through the first of the year into 1919. And that again rolls again into the next year. And there's another major wave in March of 1919. And in fact, the influenza outbreak, although it is labeled as the influenza outbreak in some cases of 1918, this goes on into 1920 and even in some aspects into 1921, although the first major outbreak here in the fall of 1918 is what often gets remembered in many ways. Now, what happens with this influenza outbreak? Well, there's a number of issues that are coming forth, and I selected these images here from newspapers to kind of emphasize just how impactful influenza is on everyday life. we can go into the death toll in many ways. I mean, it's rather striking. There are estimates of 50 million to 100 million people worldwide that are dying of influenza over those years. It's impacting local schools. There are closings of schools, universities. As these images show, theaters are closing down, billiards halls, churches, lodges, in some cases hotels, dance halls, and conventions, all being shut down across the Midwest. And I think it's rather interesting, too, that one on the far right there, highlighting a single community. This is Columbia, Missouri, in 1918, in October there. And it's just running through a list of all the events that have been postponed just in a single day or a single week, just because of fears about going in public, being in confined spaces with the threat of influenza. Now, when I broached this topic and thought about the idea of athletics, there were two articles and two reference points here that really struck me, and they come at different ways to this idea of the influenza outbreak. And I'll go right to left on this one because I think they both bring up some very interesting points. The first one, which really keyed my interest into the idea of athletics and sports and influenza, came forth in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from October. This is a kind of looks like a serial publication, Sports Salad by I believe that's L.C. Davis, where he basically has kind of a bit of a poem, a ballad of influenza, talking about how there is no more sports in many ways. We've closed our favorite resorts, away from the crowd we must stay. The world is sadly out of sorts. Where are the sports of yesterday? Kind of hinting at the idea that everything has been shut down. Where is the entertainment? Where is the recreation? Where is the outlet? As many people found sports to be an opportunity to kind of get away from everyday life. So that was rather interesting. The other one comes from a newspaper in Kansas, from Sterling, Kansas. And it kind of brings home the idea of a commentary like Mr. Davis's to the right there. And this was about the idea of bringing teenage students, boys and girls, to the idea of supporting the war effort, supporting soldiers overseas. And it's really striking in the first sentence there. Have you wished for a book or a picture show or a football game since the flu quarantine has been on? Did you ever before realize what they meant to you? How important these things of everyday life that you took for granted are for you now that they are gone? What would you do if you were in the trenches of France, far from home and all those you hold dear? There your bed would be in the mud and your nearest friend would be the cootie bugs. By night you would stare out across no man's land, and every morning shadow would seem to be a whole regiment of Germans. So in many ways it's suggesting, yes, you sure have it tough, not being able to go to a movie or to go to a football game, but imagine yourself overseas, suffering through the war. Imagine much worse fate than that. So I thought that was rather interesting in the two perspectives there of, a longing for a return to sports, and the other one saying, yes, we miss these things, but there are more important things to worry about in everyday life. And the final one that really struck me and what gave this presentation its title is this letter to the editor, a person only known as G as it's defined there. This is from the Columbia Missourian, and it talks about the Missouri spirit, and it references, there was no chance to really get involved in athletics. There was no chance to get involved in campus life at the University of Missouri in the fall of 1918 due to influenza, and something else to talk about here in a second, the SATC. Mass gatherings were over with, football were over with. There was no way to show school spirit. But now it's saying here in January 1919, the university has come back to life. It is seemingly nearly normal again. And it is hoped that people will return back to the sports arenas, back to the sport itself, to show their spirit, to get involved. And it closes here by saying, surely the Missouri spirit that has meant so much in the lives of students in the past is not dying out. And it suggests something rather interestingly that I've also caught in other newspapers, especially over at the University of Kansas, which was there was a seemingly lack of interest in sports immediately afterwards for fear of large gatherings and things like that. So it's certainly suggesting people to come back, to rejoin society, rejoin especially sports as a form of recreation and a kind of shift away from the toil and concerns and destruction going on around them. Now, One of the first things to really take note of here as we look at 1918 in the fall there is the idea that, it wasn't necessarily influenza early on that was threatening sports seasons in that fall. The baseball season had ended by September, so there was no concern about the World Series or anything like that being shut down due to the influenza outbreak. Really, it is football that takes the first major hit as we get into October, and we can begin to see the signs of it here actually in late September. But it's not influenza that draws the attention. It's something called the SATC. And what the SATC was the Student Army Training Corps. And essentially what this did was for students in high schools as well as in colleges to better prepare them to transition into the military as they were called up during the war. There was many training programs at these various schools where they would train during the day, they would take classes, they would stay on campus, and when their time came, they would be called up into the military. Due to those moment's notice call-ups, students were not really allowed to go very far off of campus. So early on in September, the fear is not so much that influenza will cancel seasons or affect the sport, but more so that the call-up for war has not only taken men away from universities as coaches and the students, but even those who are left still on campus might be called up and you won't be able to even field a team. So interestingly, as we get into early October, a lot of football teams, especially at the college level, were not allowed to travel for long games. They couldn't go very far due to concerns about, being called up at a time when you're off, maybe in the next state playing a football game. So there was a need to reestablish schedules and reestablish games so that a school could travel a short distance and be back in the same day so that call-up happened, there could still be that 24-hour turnaround. So in these images here, we can see not only the questions about, can students leave campus, but also the idea that the famed Missouri-Kansas football game, which had been held in November, might have to be canceled because of not so much influenza early on, but fears about being called up for war. Now, by October, though, as influenza takes hold in many communities, as the death toll increases, as more and more people are getting sick, it essentially shuts down high school and college football in and around Missouri and Kansas, and even in places like Nebraska and Oklahoma as well. The first image there really highlights that football games are all off. The Spanish flu has put a damper on the gridiron. We can also see from high school football notes there the idea that the flu offensive is busting the line to pieces these days. For the second time, the high school season has been postponed on account of the epidemic. Across the state in St. Louis, the Washington University and St. Louis University had to cancel their games early on. And even University of Kansas and the University of Missouri had to shift their schedule and cancel early games as well. So it certainly has an impact here as we get into mid-October. And I think that's something rather significant in many ways was, how impactful that was rather quickly as there is the shutdown of theaters and of churches and movie houses, various shows, anything within a kind of limited capacity space. Sports takes an impact from that as well overall. And there was something that really struck me was that I just wasn't seeing that in a lot of ways of what was being told about this 1918 influenza epidemic. It was often the idea of health concerns about confined spaces, but it was involving all major gatherings of a lot of people. And at the same time that this is going on here in October, the University of Missouri closes for a period of time. The University of Kansas closes for a period of time. A number of small schools across the state, high schools and colleges, even elementary schools, close. And what they assume early on is that this is going to be a closure of perhaps a week. And when you read the newspapers, you can see them saying, we're going to close down school for this week. We think by next week we'll be ready to go, but we'll just have a meeting at the end of the week to decide. And for most of these schools, it lasts a month. Some of them are 2 months. Some of them last from October into January that they're closed down, just simply because of the number of people sick with the influenza at the time and the flu. Now, interestingly enough, we also begin to see, and I'll highlight more of this in a minute, the incorporation, much as today, of masks. I didn't include some of these images just simply for space and time, but as the games are canceled, some of these schools are still having practice. So the players are wearing masks as they are practicing. If you're a student, especially at the University of Missouri at this point, to go to class or to go anywhere on campus, you have to wear a mask. They're being given out by the Red Cross. So, that becomes a common component of this time period as well here in October of 1918. Now, that does not affect everybody, though. Schools take the approach to the pandemic in different ways. And I think this is something that becomes really interesting in how different organizations, different schools approach the subject matter. Like I mentioned early on, the concern about the war caused a question about postponing the University of Missouri, University of Kansas football game. Ultimately, it is canceled in late November of 1918, as there is kind of fears of a resurgence of influenza. So instead, the University of Kansas meets with what is today Kansas State University in Lawrence for the game for that one. So there's a renewal. There's a meeting of that game in replacement of the University of Missouri, University of Kansas game. On the other side of the border there, the University of Missouri shuts down completely. There is no football that season at all. And in fact, this is kind of one of the more startling cartoons of that era there is the closed gates of the football stadium guarded by what appears to be a student officer there brandishing a weapon there, guarding the gates. And it says closed due to influenza. And this is in the Savitar, the University of Missouri's essentially yearbook at that point, highlighting that year there was no football. It was just gone in many ways. So I think that was rather striking. And this is one of the images I often share with my students when I talk about the 1918 influenza outbreak is this subtle image here, especially for students at the university here, about the impact it had on life at that point, how the wide shutdowns of many different things impacted, not just simply, as I said, churches and movie theaters and things like that, but even something like football as well gets impacted overall. Now, as I said, schools are going to approach this in a number of different ways. And as we get into October and November here, we can see how influenza impacts and the waves of influenza impact a lot of different organizations. So I'll highlight a few here that I read are interesting as I came across them. First and foremost, after the Kansas City high schools canceled the first part of their season, they renewed it again in November. After the first wave in October had seemingly subsided, you see an effort to renew the football season, and a number of Kansas City high schools will reorganize for an abbreviated season in November of that year. So very quickly, high school football comes back in Kansas City. Over on the right there, we can see that cadets at the Wentworth Military Academy actually are wearing masks in their game against, I'm trying to think who they're playing. Oh yes, St. John's Military Academy of Salina, Kansas. They're wearing masks as they're playing the game, an incorporation of protection, but also the effort to keep the sport alive for portions of that year. On the bottom left there, we can see that a game between Kansas City, Kansas and St. Joseph, Missouri has been postponed due to influenza, but yet farther south, Fort Scott and Joplin can still have a football game that year. And the final two ones I think are rather interesting in some ways. In the middle there, the clamping of the lid back on the city as a result of the increase in number of influenza cases will not interfere with the game. This was a game between Washburn and Haskell, suggesting that even though there was efforts to redouble earlier quarantines, earlier lockdowns of different facilities, this game is on no matter what, it's suggesting in some ways. And finally, something that's always struck me as very interesting and something I hope to pursue a little farther is the Western U versus Liberty AC. I don't think a lot of people realize the outline of sports here in the early 20th century and how unique it was in some ways. Today we think of conferences, we think of divisions, we think of high school, junior college, small college, big college. Back then, in some ways, a game could be found between what would be considered some of the major universities today and small athletic organizations, small high schools. And one of those was a group called the Interstate Athletic Association. And this was a segregated athletic conference due to white schools in Missouri and Kansas and Illinois not playing predominantly African-American schools due to segregation. This Interstate Athletic Association formed as a way for various African-American schools to compete against one another in various activities, running from football to basketball to track, to even things like debate and other forms of activities at the high school level and college level. And this incorporated a number of institutions. In the image there, we can see Western Universities, which is in Quidaro, Kansas, just across the border there from downtown Kansas City, is playing against Liberty AC, which is Liberty, Missouri's athletic organization. There was also Kansas City's high schools. There was Sumner, there was Lincoln High School, there was Lincoln Institute in Jefferson City, Douglas High School in Columbia, Sumner High School in St. Louis, Lincoln High School in East St. Louis, as well as a number of schools in St. Joseph and Topeka, Kansas as well. In fact, it was the Topeka Industrial and Educational Institute, TIEI, and George R. Smith College in Sedalia. So something that's very fascinating is how their season progresses as well. And that poses a real challenge in an interesting way, because think of the earlier restrictions on travel. If you're Sumner High School in St. Louis and you're having to play, Western University in Quidaro, Kansas, and that's a very long trip in some ways. So the renewal of that athletic conference, I think, is interesting as well, and how that comes back into play in November as well. Perhaps the most unique perspective that I found on this was in St. Louis here, which is an effort to not only really remember the war effort as we get into November of 1918, but also to bring sports back in a large venue sense. And this was a large tournament of a number of different sports held in St. Louis in mid-November, a doubleheader football game between Scott Field, which was Scott Air Force Base today, which is in Edwardsville, Illinois, versus Camp Funston, right? The famous Camp Funston from earlier. St. Louis University playing Great Lakes Aviators, another military training facility, as well as a soccer game, a soccer football game there at the bottom going on there as well. This included a number of athletic opportunities in the city, and was really promoted as a way to keep not only the soldiers fit, but emphasize how important athletics and training and recreation was in someone's everyday life, keeping people fit. And this was something that, again, as influenza is raging across the country, this is still being held in an outdoor context, again, to bring people and make them fit and healthy and bring awareness to athletics once more. Finally, I think something that's rather interesting in all of this, coming back to the idea of masks, was how, especially at the university level, it was approached in regards to influenza as we get into 1919. It had largely subsided in the minds of many people, although there would be, as I said, a March resurgence once more. But as we see early on, there are efforts to continue with what is today deemed to be mask wearing, social distancing, things like that. So for the first 3 games of the University of Missouri's basketball season in 1919, masks had to be worn at all times when you were in what was at that point Rothwell Gymnasium to play. So as they played Iowa State, as they're playing Washington University, as they're playing, I believe that's Westminster and the last one on the right there, all through those games you had to basically bring a mask to wear. And if you could not find a mask, not bring a mask, you could buy them from the Red Cross at the gate to come in. So I thought that was rather interesting in the approach to that. Even as places across the country are beginning to seemingly open up, there is still an effort to provide sports in what they deem to be a safe manner by wearing masks and limiting the amount of people who can come into the arena to watch the various games. In comparison to that, the University of Kansas did not require a similar idea of wearing masks. The first couple of games in January, as I try to provide some comparison to the University of Missouri, the first couple of advertisements did not include any reference to masks or any request for people to bring masks. And in fact, here on the bottom is the advertisement for the Missouri-Kansas game to be played in January, at the very end of January and early February, which remarks not only that there is not so much mask wearing, but that there is actually recreation afterwards, music, dancing, and games to be held at the basketball gym afterwards. So that was rather an interesting comparison there on the idea of athletics as we get into 1919. Now, as we get into 1919, there is certainly a lot of hope, as there is hope in some ways in present day, that the epidemic is over with or will be over with in the near future, that health will return, and that there will be a return to normalcy. And in many ways, sports offers that venue for a lot of people to get together and a lot of people to kind of forget their worries and watch a sporting event. And there are three major events immediately in 1919 and afterwards with connections to the Midwest and to Missouri and to Kansas that I think are rather interesting to talk about, because as people are returning back and we look nationwide, there are major sporting events that each had a major kind of falling out after influenza and certainly a resurgence once more. The first of them is the 1919 World Series. As the 1918 World Series was allowed to be played with no restrictions, no cancellations, 1919 is the same way. As we get into that baseball season in the spring and into the summer and into September, there are no major obstacles, no major objections to the season to be played, as there had been with football earlier, or even with some early stuff with basketball. But 1919 is a very controversial series due to the fact that the Chicago White Sox in that year were alleged to have thrown the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. It was alleged against them that 8 of their players had taken bribes from gamblers to throw different games of the series, essentially losing them for a cash payoff. Ultimately, they are indicted by a grand jury in 1920 after they almost make it to the playoffs once more. They are brought to trial in 1921 for conspiracy to defraud various people involved in the World Series. Essentially, it was not a regulated game because they were in it to lose it automatically for the money. They are found innocent by the jury in this regard. And in fact, there are many cheers heard within the jury and within the crowd as they are found innocent. Ultimately, it was alleged that they actually partied and met up with the jurors later on after being found innocent. And this cartoon, which comes from the St. Louis Star, kind of emphasizes the scandal of it. Essentially, you have the indicted ball players sliding into the base there, bottles raining down from the crowd, and the jury's hands signaling safe to the runner, that they have been deemed safe from whatever alleged crimes they committed. Ultimately, these 8 individuals would be banned from professional baseball by the new commissioner, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and would never be allowed to play professional baseball ever again. So it certainly is a stark scandal to begin sports and activities in the wake of World War I and the influenza outbreak. The second one is rather interesting, is the 1920 Summer Olympics. The Summer Olympics was the first one to be held in a couple of years because in 1916, the Summer Olympics had been canceled due to the outbreak of World War I. So a number of very promising athletes had not been allowed to compete for roughly 8 years from the 1912 Summer Olympics. So there is actually a number of stories of very promising athletes in their prime in 1916, 1917, unable to compete and essentially losing their chance on the world stage. In 1920, the Olympics were held in Belgium, and it was to be a large international affair, really a celebration of sportsmanship and of camaraderie and of return again to normalcy. And in that Summer Olympics, there are a number of athletes from the Midwest who compete. Most notable among them include Brutus Hamilton, who was from Harrisonville, Missouri, so a little bit southeast of Kansas City, who competes and ultimately finishes with the silver medal in the decathlon, as well as Everett Bradley from the University of Kansas, who competes in the pentathlon and wins a silver medal as well. Alongside both individuals is Jackson Scholes, who is from the University of Missouri as well, who wins a gold medal in the 4x100 relay, although he loses out in 4th place in the 100-meter dash at that point. So the image here on the right especially is of Everett Bradley and Brutus Hamilton there And they are, if you go from left to right, number 4 and number 5 there on the list with M and then the TKT on their jerseys. And actually, Hamilton is rather interesting. He grows up in Harrisonville, Missouri, is a noted track star and football star at the University of Missouri. In fact, his first year of competition as a football athlete was canceled due to the influenza outbreak at the University of Missouri. He later becomes a track coach, not at Missouri, where he was certainly in the running for competition, but actually briefly serving at the University of Kansas as a track coach before moving on to a very large and successful career at the University of California at Berkeley. And finally, I'll conclude today with the Amateur Athletic Union, the AAU. The AAU is still around for today, but in the early days, the AAU served as an opportunity as a transition point for athletes from high school and college to before they get to the professional level. Today, if you're in college and you are going to go into professional sports, you usually sign an agent, you're declared ineligible for amateur competition, and you are no longer allowed to compete anymore at the amateur level. The AAU offered an opportunity for athletes in this time who wanted to essentially keep their options open, but not necessarily commit to playing professionally. In some ways, it would be seen as being, in cases, somewhat illegal today for being paid for your services as an athlete to no longer be considered an amateur. But this is also a gateway to the Olympics as well. And the AAU was one of the first major basketball tournaments, although it incorporated many different sports, to be held prior to what is today the NCAA tournament, which is, of course, the March Madness, everything that goes on kind of in the spring of the year. So with the AAU, it's held in a number of different locations, including St. Louis at the 1904 World's Fair. But it makes a home in Kansas City in 1921. So pretty soon after the war, pretty soon after the influenza outbreak. And it stays in Kansas City for about 14 to 15 years, setting up shop in the convention center downtown. And this image actually is of a basketball game in the convention center to kind of give you an idea of how it would be set up to play basketball in that arena. The AAU met in Kansas City for those 15 years. And over that stretch of time, you could owe this to success of various teams. You could owe this to perhaps location and travel restrictions, things like that. But for the first 12 or 13 years, a team from Missouri or Kansas was in the championship game of the AAU basketball tournament. And as Kansas City is a big basketball city, I think that's rather striking and startling in some ways to read that. These were teams that included everything from college teams that wanted to compete to athletic clubs to even corporations having company teams that competed overall. In fact, there was some, various teams associated with companies in and around the Kansas City area who won championships that year. And in fact, most notably, some of the major athletes in Missouri and Kansas of that time, some of them actually left college early to play on AAU teams. So I thought that was rather striking in 1920 and 1921 as we get into Kansas City there. So overall today, I really wanted to highlight in some ways a interesting perspective on World War I and the influenza outbreak of 1918. Certainly, it's an important subject to look back at and something I think many people knew about, but they didn't really know the whole story about it. And I think it's something that COVID-19 has brought an awareness to, was looking back on how things were 100 plus years ago in relation to a major crisis of global proportions. And I think in some ways we need to understand how this impacted our communities and our hometowns and the places we live in now. And I think this focus on athletics, while perhaps trivial in some ways to the larger crises of the time, I think offers an idea and an opportunity to look at these various communities and see how they approached the epidemic, how they approached war, and how many people sought what they deemed to be a return to normalcy at the end of both. In an effort to bring back what they saw as a previous American society. So I thank you very much for joining me today, and I look forward to any questions that you have about the subject.
Dr. Ross, thank you for sharing your knowledge and feedback. I love what you said about the whole story. I mean, that's all that we're here as a Kansas City Museum, as a new museum, is telling the whole story or the multiple perspectives of different histories and different events that happened that changed our time. Question that came up, can you just we go back to why it was called the Spanish flu?
Oh, sure. So there have been a number of questions about this, and something that's been brought up quite a bit. So the idea is that early on, as the influenza outbreak is occurring, there is concern about spreading news about the origins of the outbreak or its impact upon especially soldiers in a time of war. So it's the news is not really brought up much in the newspapers and the media at the time. And it's often been attributed to the media and the newspapers of Spain as the first ones really bringing awareness to this. It was argued that as cases were beginning to be seen in Spain, that they were bringing an awareness to this. They were not ultimately very tied up in World War I, so they were kind of more neutral in this. So they were able to discuss it more openly, and they were bringing awareness to, where is this influenza outbreak coming from? What is happening? And many people attributed it to Spain, then calling it the Spanish flu, because of its coverage in Spain, as they were reporting on, Spanish language newspapers are reporting on cases in Spain. It's seen as, oh, this is something that's being originating in Spain. Actual later evidence suggests that due to the kind of rural nature of Camp Funston, that it was most likely originated in Kansas with soldiers there as they are shipped across the country, as they are shipped globally for World War I. They are infected and they are taking it with them, and that's really where the major spread comes from. So it gets attributed to Spain because of the coverage by newspapers in Spain to what is going on for them locally, but also in Europe and globally. But the origin in some ways has been tracked back to Kansas and Camp Funston in more present day context.
Can you show us a picture of that camp again?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So this is from, there's a number of fascinating images, especially that have come forward. This is from the Kansas Historical Society of what was labeled as Camp Funston at that time. I'm not sure the exact location of where this picture was taken from at Camp Funston, but this is where it's been attributed to in images.
Great, thank you. Another question, can you tell us a little bit more or remind us about the SATC and how
Sure, definitely. So the SATC, and let me get everything back here for you so I can, is the Student Army Training Corps. I wanted to make sure I had the title right. So the Student Army Training Corps is created in 1917, 1918 by the United States War Department in an effort to train students, especially people who are draft eligible, people who've been 17 or 18 years old, at the high school level, but especially at the college level, to be called up and enlisted in the military as World War I was progressing. They, even in October of 1918, there was rumors that the war was ending, but nothing was confirmed yet. It was all kind of wild speculation. So even in 1918, in October and November, people were still preparing to be sent off to war. And in fact, most of these SATCs are not shut down until really the beginning of 1919, when it's confirmed that war is concluded. There is no more need for major shipments of soldiers out. So a student would enlist in the SATC on campus. They would take college courses. They would train, do military training on campus. And in fact, a number of colleges actually had various branches of the military training sites on campus. So there might be a naval facility, there might be an Army facility on site, even Army, still pretty early for Army Air Corps, but the early formal Army Air Corps. And because of the requirements for them on campus, you can't be too far from your training regimen. You can't be too far from your classes. There was really an effort to shut down the movement of students in and out of campus at that time. So their concern early on in September was football would have to be postponed or canceled or rescheduled because you could not travel more than 24 hours away from campus. So there was a concern that if you took a train, if you were, let's say, the University of Kansas and you were going to play the University of Colorado. There was concern that if you went on the train all the way out to Colorado, stayed there, played the game, and came back, it would be more than 24 hours. And there was concern that people would not be ready to go if they were called up, if they were off-site. So there was concern that they would have to be kind of day games. So the University of Missouri might have to play Westminster College, which today is a 30-minute drive from the University of Missouri campus. But even by train at that point would have been a very short trip that could have been done in a day. Or Washington University would have played St. Louis University in St. Louis because they're in the same city. There was efforts to reschedule games that had been originally been booked in an effort to keep people close together while still abiding by the SATC rules.
Great. Thank you for shedding more light. A couple of comments that came in. Margaret says, we have a suitcase marked Camp Funston in our collection.
Fascinating.
Cool fun fact there.
Yeah.
Interesting how history repeats itself. A lot of parallels that were happening almost 100 years are happening now with all the mandates and masking and how sports are coming back. I think this fall they're going to come back at full capacity in some stadiums with some still requiring masks. So that's kind of a lot of parallels there. Interesting how the Red Cross was helping and how you could purchase masks from the Red Cross.
Yeah, that was something that's something that really struck me. I think in a lot of ways when I was going through the presentation, I was going through the football season, I was going through the fall, excuse me, and I was like, well, what's the next sport? Basketball is the next sport. Okay, well, let's see what's going on with basketball. And I was looking especially at the high school level at first, and I wasn't seeing a whole lot of changes to the schedule. I wasn't seeing the same thing where, like, you know, a high school might cancel the sports season for football, but they're still playing basketball. So I wasn't seeing a whole lot of that. And then I decided to just check in at the university level. And that's where I began to find these advertisements for the University of Missouri, where they're saying, you know, masks are required and the Red Cross is on campus selling masks. It was something that was done for a number of weeks on campus there, where anytime you were at a public gathering or a class, you had to wear a mask. If you were going to the basketball games, you had to wear a mask. If you didn't have one, they would be sold to you by the Red Cross. But by February of 1919, that's done away with, and the mask requirement is gone from campus by February 1919.
Okay. Going back on those advertisements, can you go back? Someone's wondering if you know what the war tax was. There's a fee for entry for the sports game, and then
yeah,
there, including war tax.
I'll admit, I'm not 100% sure on that one. That's one of the few times I saw it in that regard. Because if you can see the University of Missouri ones there at the top of the screen, they list the general admission price, but they're not including the war tax on that one. So the bottom one is from Lawrence, Kansas. So that may have been something locally to fund perhaps, you know, the nearby military base at Fort Riley or some other maybe revenue generation to support the war effort. I'm not 100% sure on that one. I'd be interested to find out more myself.
Great. Going to your slide on the 1920 Olympians that were from Missouri. Remind us who they were again in that photo.
Sure. So in the photo right here, the fourth from the left there, the one with the M on his chest, but does not have the kind of the dark slash that goes across it, is Brutus Hamilton. Brutus Hamilton is from Harrisonville, Missouri. His brother actually played football at the University of Missouri and ran track before him. He comes to the university in 1918. As a student, he is considered one of the best athletes on campus. He's thought to be competing in every sport. Ultimately, he settles in on track, although he does play football. His freshman year is canceled at football due to the influenza outbreak. And him and actually Everett Bradley from the University of Kansas, who's the gentleman to the right, as we see him, of Brutus Hamilton, were quite competitive. In fact, I would advise people to look into their competition. I don't think it was an ugly rivalry or anything, or a hateful rivalry, but they are certainly, they're competing in the same track events as in the spring every year. So they are ultimately kind of 1-2 in a lot of these various events. So they are considered the best of the best in the Midwest when it comes to track, especially the pentathlon. And it's kind of a stark surprise because while Hamilton wins and is considered one of the best pentathlon athletes in the United States going into the Olympics of that year, he finishes sixth in the Summer Olympics in 1920. And Bradley, who has often kind of been in his rearview mirror, in his shadow, gets the silver medal that year. And then ultimately kind of Hamilton regains his composure and becomes the silver medalist in the decathlon in that same Olympics. The other one would have been Jackson Scholes, who was a sprinter at the University of Missouri. He's originally from Michigan, and he won the gold medal in the 4x100 relay that year, finished fourth in the 100-meter dash, and later on won, I think, one or two medals in subsequent Olympics in 1924, I believe, in 1928. So a number of athletes kind of in the Missouri, Kansas area, especially for track, competing at a high level in that Olympics.
Do you happen to know if any family members still exist or they're around?
That I'm not sure of. There was an article put out last summer by the University of Missouri celebrating the 1920 Olympics because they had essentially 3 track athletes and 1 coach on that team. The one athlete, George Massengale, was his name, didn't compete because he actually got injured right before the Olympics started. So he was not actually going to compete overall. So he didn't finish in any of the races. Their coach was Robert Simpson, who had been denied ability to compete in the 1916 Olympics due to its cancellation. And he kind of guides them as they are heading over to the Olympics that year. So of those, I'm not sure. Brutus Hamilton is the one I know the most about. He moves to California for the rest of his life and coaches out there. I believe George Massengale's family lived in the St. Louis area for a period of time, and they may still be in Missouri. I'm not 100% sure of that. Jackson Scholes became a journalist and actually traveled all over the country. And interestingly, I didn't include this, but it's kind of interesting. He becomes one of the main characters, real life person, a character in the movie Chariots of Fire, which is based on the 1920 Olympics in the 1920s from a British perspective, but he is portrayed in that movie as well as one of the main track stars.
It's a fun fact there. Couple of questions before we end our show. Do you know where their gold medals are? Do you know where these artifacts are? Do you guys have them in your collection, or?
We do not. We have some memorabilia related to Helen Stevens, who is from Fulton, Missouri. She competes in the 1936 Olympics. We don't have her medals that I'm aware of from that Olympics, but we do have some of her scrapbooks. We have some of her uniforms and track shoes and things like that from her career. Some of it are Olympics related. Some of it are from her time in college and as a kind of amateur athlete. So I don't know on those. I would assume they'd be with the family, but I'm not 100% sure.
Was there anything that surprised you as you researched this topic?
I think one of the big ones was the mask requirement at the University of Missouri Games. I think was the big one. I talked about that a little bit ago. But overall, I was just so fascinated by digging into yearbooks from this time. And the society here, State Historical Society of Missouri, has a extensive, although not completely universal, yearbook collection, both colleges as well as high schools. And I was digging into high schools from all over Missouri, looking at the 1919 yearbook, right? Would have been the fall of 1918, the spring of 1919, and just seeing, how is this discussed in their everyday life? And, there were students who were writing their class history, right? And freshmen, we did this. As sophomores, we did this. As juniors, we did this. And as seniors, half our school year was canceled due to influenza, or they would have poems about, dealing with war and dealing with illness. Or, my high school wasn't around in 1918, but I found another high school in the same community that would have been in existence. And it's just interesting to see 1918, yearbook, all these things about athletics, all these pictures and everything like that. 1920, the same thing. And in 1919, there's just nothing for athletics. There's just like one picture of the basketball team. That's it, because they just didn't have athletics that year because everything was just shut down.
It'll be fun not fun, but a good comparison about yearbooks now and yearbooks then 50 years
sure.
from now, see what the similarities really. How can someone take a little deeper dive into this topic? Where can they go? Where can they research? Any?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a number of things. Of course, there are a number of newspapers online. Library of Congress has them. We at the Historical Society have them. Newspapers.com has them. You can see them in-house. You can see them in a digital format. And most of them are keyword searchable. So even something as simple as, typing in influenza and football or influenza and masks from 1918, 1919 will yield a number of matching results. Like I said, the Historical Society here has a number of yearbooks that can be requested from a surprising number from 1918, 1919, especially the bigger the high school, especially the more likely we are to have those publications. And a lot of that coincides with the fact that we were founded by the Missouri Press Association in 1898 as a means to collect and preserve Missouri newspapers. Mm-hmm. So one of our earliest collections has always been publications. So we have an extensive newspaper collection over time, but also there have been efforts as publishing houses were making high school yearbooks, especially early on, they would send us copies and people have donated them as well. So those are fascinating ones. And I will tell people those go up into almost present day. I have found some of my friends' high school yearbooks from all over the state. I have sent them pictures of their yearbook pictures to remind them that I have this evidence of them when they were 16 or 17 years old. So just extensive stuff like that, it offers a really unique perspective into local communities and things that I didn't even know about my own hometown in Missouri at that point in 1918 through 1921. I think were just absolutely fascinating to be found in yearbooks and in local newspapers.
And those requests can be, how do they get a hold of you? Is it a phone call or email or website? What?
Yeah, so our website is shsmo.org, and you can go on there and you can make research requests, or you can also book appointment times at our various research centers across the state to look through different materials from all the different collections. Everything from you can request various manuscript collections, as well as, especially here in Columbia, there's a large collection of newspapers as well as yearbooks on site. So that makes it easy for a lot of people.
All right. Well, Dr. Sean Rosst, thank you so much for shedding light and this new perspective of sports and pandemic, and how there was a lot of parallels from happening now to back almost 100 years ago. So thank you for your time and your knowledge. And thank you, audience, for leading us into your office, wherever you're at today and at home.
Well, thank you, Paul. And thank you, everyone else, for joining me. I'm happy to talk about history.
And thank you so much to One Kansas City Radio for doing all the technology behind the scenes, and also it will be available on a podcast. This program will always live on our Facebook page and also on our website at kansascitymuseum.org. That's kansascitymuseum.org. Take a look there of what's happening virtually. My goal is to have these Restore KC virtual programs at least once or twice a month, as we gear up to reopen the doors safely this fall to welcome you back to Corinthian Hall, the mansion, as a new museum of Kansas City history and culture heritage. So stay tuned for more virtual programs and also outdoor safe distance events and concerts. My name is Paul Gutierrez, Director of Programs and Events for the Kansas City Museum. It was my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Please be safe out there. And as always, please be kind to one another. Have a good weekend.